What if I told you there was a small block V8 that dominated the darkest days of American performance, when insurance companies ruled the streets and the EPA had manufacturers by the throat? Picture this. It's 1971, and while the muscle car era is dying a painful death, Chrysler engineers are secretly building what would become the most underrated engine of the decade. 275 horsepower. That's all they claimed. But this unassuming power plant would embarrass big blocks, outlast its competition, and prove that proper engineering could overcome any restriction Washington threw at it. This is the story of the Mopar 360, the small block that shocked everyone by becoming the undisputed king of the Smog-Era. The year was 1971, and the American automotive landscape was transforming into something unrecognizable. Insurance companies had declared war on performance cars, slapping young drivers with premiums that cost more than the cars themselves. The Clean Air Act was forcing manufacturers to choke their engines with emissions equipment that strangled power and destroyed drivability. Compression ratios were plummeting from 11:1 to 8:1. Camshafts were being neutered. The government mandated that all cars run on regular unleaded gas by 1975. Every manufacturer was scrambling, detuning their engines, adding EGR valves, air pumps, and catalytic converters that turned fire-breathing monsters into wheezing shadows of their former selves. Renford's 351 Cleveland, once rated at 300 horsepower, would drop to 150 by 1973. Chevrolet's legendary small block 350 fell from 370 horses to barely 175. Even Pontiac's mighty 455 Super Duty would be dead by 1974. The performance car seemed destined for extinction. But deep in Highland Park, Michigan, a small team of Chrysler engineers had a different idea. They weren't going to surrender. They were going to fight back with intelligence instead of brute force. The 360 cubic inch LA Series V8 wasn't supposed to be special. It started life as a stroked version of Chrysler's workhorse 318, itself an evolution of the 1964 LA 273. The bore measured 4.0 inches, the stroke stretched to 3.58 inches, giving exactly 339 cubic inches of displacement. On paper, it looked like another victim of the emissions era, rated at just 275 gross horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 340 lb-ft of torque at 3,200 RPM. When the industry switched to more honest net ratings in 1972, that dropped to 245 horsepower. But those numbers told only part of the story. The real magic was hiding in the details that only racers and engineers would notice. Let me tell you what made this engine different. While everyone else was cutting corners to meet regulations, Chrysler engineers built the 360 like they were preparing for war. The foundation was a cast-iron block with 4-bolt main caps on the center, 3 journals, unusual strength for a small block. The crankshaft was forged steel, not cast iron like most competitors used. This wasn't for show. That forged crank could handle 7,000 RPM all day long when most small blocks would scatter at 6,000. The connecting rods were shot-peened for strength, measuring 6.123 inches center to center. The pistons were cast aluminum with a compression ratio of 8.8.1 in 1971, dropping to 8.4.1 by 1972. Low by muscle car standards, but perfectly tuned for the garbage 91-octane fuel of the era. Eins in, but here's where it gets interesting. The cylinder heads were the secret weapon. Chrysler used what they called J-heads, technically casting numbers 3418915 or 3671587. These heads featured 1.88-inch intake valves and 1.60-inch exhaust valves, smaller than the 2.02160 setup on the Performance 340. But the ports, oh, those ports. The intake ports flowed 190 CFM at 500-inch lift, the exhausts pushed to 140 CFM. Compare that to a Chevy 350 stock heads flowing maybe 165 CFM intake. The combustion chambers measured 65 cc, later enlarged to 70-42 cc for lower compression. The valve springs were calibrated for a maximum lift of 0.480 inches with an installed height of 1.65 inches. Stock spring pressure was 95 pounds seated, 240 pounds open. Nanny Chen. The real genius was in the intake manifold and carburetor selection. In an era when everyone was shrinking carburetors to meet emissions, Chrysler slapped a Thermoquad on top, a massive 850 CFM unit with tiny primaries for fuel economy and enormous secondaries for when you mashed the throttle. The spread bore design meant 1.50-inch primaries and 2.25-inch secondaries. That carburetor could flow more air than most big blocks were using. The intake manifold was a dual-plane aluminum casting that kept port velocity high while allowing tremendous flow at wide-open throttle. Chrysler engineers knew something critical. Emissions tests were performed at part throttle. What happened at full throttle was still fair game. And the camshaft specifications revealed their strategy. The 1971-72 360 two-barrel cam had 252 degrees of intake duration, 260 degrees exhaust, measured at 0.050-inch lift. Valve lift was 410 intake, 420 exhaust. The four-barrel version ran 268 to 276 degrees duration with 429-444-inch lift. By comparison, the high-performance 340 cam was 268 to 276 with 0.429-444 lift, nearly identical. The lobe separation angle was 114 degrees, wider than typical performance cams. This reduced overlap, which helped emissions at idle while still providing strong mid-range torque. The timing chain was a true roller unit, not a cheap link belt design. It wouldn't stretch and retard cam timing like the competition's chains did after 30,000 miles. Now, let's talk about what this meant on the street. In 1971, you could walk into a Dodge dealer and order a Demon 340 for about $3,500. Insurance would cost you another $2,000 a year if you were under 25. Or you could buy a Dart Swinger with the 360 for $2,800 and pay normal insurance rates. The 360 car was maybe half a second slower in the quarter mile. We're talking 14.9 seconds at 93 mph for the 360 versus 14.3 at 96 for the 340. But here's the thing. In the real world, from a stoplight, the 360 car would often win. That massive torque peak at 3,200 RPM meant it would roast the tires through first gear and half of second. The 340 needed to be wound up to make power. The 360 just pulled in. The 1972 model year brought lower compression and net horsepower ratings, but also refinements. Chrysler added hardened valve seats for unleaded gas compatibility. They improved the oil passages for better lubrication at high RPM. The electronic ignition system, introduced as optional in 1972 and standard by 1973, provided a hotter, more consistent spark than points ever could. While everyone else was struggling with drivability problems from lean mixtures and retarded timing, the 360 started instantly, idled smoothly, and pulled cleanly from idle to redline. Let me give you some perspective on what was happening elsewhere in 1972. The Chevrolet 350 in a Nova SS was rated at 165 net horsepower. It ran the quarter mile in 16.5 seconds at 82 mph. The Ford 351 Cleveland two-barrel in a Torino made 164 horsepower and needed 17 seconds to cover the quarter. The Pontiac 350 in a Le Mans, 160 horsepower, 17.3 seconds. Meanwhile, a Plymouth Duster 360 was clicking off 14.9-second passes at 91 mph, embarrassing cars with twice the displacement. Road Test magazine called it the sleeper performance buy of 1972, and the 1973 model year brought more challenges. Compression dropped again to 8.011. EGR valves became mandatory. The cam was slightly smaller at 252-260 degrees duration. Power fell to 170 net horsepower. But Chrysler engineers had tricks up their sleeves. The EGR valve was calibrated to stay closed at wide-open throttle. The Thermoquad carburetor secondaries were so large that even with the lean primary mixture required for emissions, The engine still got plenty of fuel when you needed it. The distributor advance curve was aggressive, 10 degrees initial, 34 degrees total, all in by 2,800 RPM. Most competitors were running 6 initial, 28 total, not all in until 4,000 RPM. And here's something most people don't know. Chrysler offered a Edge Police Package-In 360 that was essentially unchanged from 1971 specifications. It kept the hotter cam, tighter valve lash, and more aggressive timing. Rated at the same 170 horsepower for insurance purposes, these engines actually made closer to 220. They were available to anyone who knew to ask for sales code E58. A few hundred ended up in civilian cars, creating some of the fastest Weissmuller smog motors ever built. These cars would run 14.4 at 94 mph, faster than many big blocks of the era. The durability of these engines was legendary. While Ford's 351 Cleveland was eating camshafts and Chevy's 350 was spinning rod bearings, 360s just kept running. That forged crank and those beefy main bearings could take incredible abuse. Taxi companies reported 360s going 300,000 miles without rebuilds. Police departments had pursuit vehicles with 200,000 hard miles still passing compression tests. The secret was the oiling system. 5 main bearings fed through full groove bearings, priority main oiling that fed the mains before the lifters, and generous bearing clearances of 0.05 to 20 inches on the mains, 0.5 to 25 on the rods. These engines didn't make maximum power, but they made good power forever. And by 1974, the last year for true performance variants before catalytic converters arrived, the 360 had evolved into its final high-performance form. The E58 police package now included double-roller timing chain, windage tray, and heavy-duty valve springs. Chrysler also offered something special, the high-performance 360 option for Dodge's new Lil Red Express truck, though that wouldn't arrive until 1978, but the seeds were planted in 1974. Engineers knew this engine had more to give. And then let's talk modifications, because this is where the 360 really shined. The stock bottom end could handle 500 horsepower without breaking a sweat. Those J-heads responded incredibly to porting. A good port job could push flow to 230 CFM intake, 180 CFM exhaust. Headers and true dual exhausts were worth 30 horsepower. A better cam, something like 284-292 degrees duration with 0.484 510 lift, would wake the engine up dramatically. Bump compression to 10.1 with different pistons, and you had 400 honest horsepower. Total cost? About $2,000 in 1974 dollars. Rendant and the aftermarket loved the 360. Edelbrock made special intake manifolds just for it. Holley offered carburetors specifically calibrated for the 360's characteristics. TRW produced forged pistons that would handle nitrous or supercharging. Direct Connection, Chrysler's own performance parts division, sold complete blueprinted 360 short blocks for $799. They claimed 425 horsepower with their Stage 3 package. Independent dyno tests showed 445 N, but the real proof was at the drag strip. The pure stock drags, where cars had to run absolutely stock with original tires, became dominated by 360 cars. A well-driven Duster 360 could run 1470s consistently. The national record for FSA class, where 360 cars competed, was 1389 at 98 mph, set by a completely stock 1971 Demon 360. That's faster than factory 440 six-pack cars were running. The combination of lightweight, a Duster weighed just 3,100 pounds, and that massive mid-range torque made them giant killers. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. While everyone knows about the fuel crisis of 1973-74, what's less known is how the 360 actually thrived during this period. When gas hit 55 cents a gallon and people were waiting in lines, the 360's efficiency became its selling point. A Duster 360 could achieve 16 mpg Highway 12 city, remarkable for a performance engine. The secret was that massive Thermoquad carburetor. Those tiny primaries meant the engine sipped fuel during cruise. The wide ratio torque-flight transmission kept RPMs down on the highway. Compare that to a 454 Chevelle getting 8 mpg or a 429 Ford getting 7. And insurance companies had created classifications based on advertised horsepower and engine displacement. The 360 flew under the radar. It wasn't a Giager performance engine, according to their charts. It was just a Viajet small V8. Rare. A 23-year-old male would pay $180 a year to insure a Duster 360 in 1973. The same driver would pay $950 for a Cuda 340. The performance difference? Maybe 0.3 of a second in the quarter mile. This insurance loophole existed until 1976, when companies finally caught on. In the 360's influence extended beyond just Mopars. When Ford engineers were developing the 351 Modified in 1975, they studied the 360's head design extensively. GM engineers admitted in a 1978 SAE paper that the 360's port configuration influenced their small block head redesign. Even European manufacturers took notice. BMW engineers reportedly bought several 360's to study how Chrysler maintained performance while meeting emission standards. On-trend production numbers tell the real story of the 360's success. In 1971, Chrysler built 42,890 360's. By 1974, that number had grown to 389,000. Over the engine's performance lifespan from 1971 to 1980, more than 1.5 million 360's rolled off the assembly line. It powered everything from Dusters to Diplomats, Ramchargers to motorhomes. The Marine version, the 360 CID Marine, powered countless boats and was Coast Guard certified for reliability. And let me share something that really puts this engine in perspective. In 1974, Car and Driver conducted a comparison test of the most affordable performance cars. They tested a Duster 360, a Nova 350, a Maverick 302, and an AMC Hornet 360. The Duster won every acceleration category, 0 to 60 in 7.9 seconds, quarter mile in 15.1 at 90.5 mph, top speed of 118 mph. The Nova, 9.2 seconds to 60, 16.8 second quarter mile. The magazine concluded, Writers, in an era where performance is supposedly dead, Chrysler proves that clever engineering beats displacement every time. And the racing legacy of the 360 extends far beyond drag strips. In SCCA Trans Am racing, where engines were limited to 360 cubic inches, privateer teams running distroked 360's were competitive with factory Ford and Chevy efforts. In NASCAR's Sportsman division, 360-powered Dodge Chargers won 47 races between 1972 and 1975. Richard Petty himself tested a 360 for the Cup Series, though rules eventually favored bigger engines. In NHRA Stock Eliminator, 360 cars held national records in 5 different classes simultaneously in 1975. On Anshansan, the engine's design influenced Chrysler's future development profoundly. When they created the Magnum series in 1992, it was essentially an updated 360 with better heads and fuel injection. That engine powered millions of Dodge Rams, Dakotas, Durangos, and Jeep Grand Cherokees. The bore spacing, deck height, and basic architecture remained unchanged. Even today, you can bolt 1971 360 heads onto a 2003 Magnum block. That's 32 years of compatibility, unheard of in the automotive world. But what really made the 360 special wasn't just the numbers or the engineering, it was the timing. This engine gave working-class Americans performance they could afford during the worst period in automotive history. While the rich kids were paying massive insurance premiums for their big blocks, regular folks were building sleeper 360's that would blow their doors off. It democratized performance in a way that hadn't been seen before and wouldn't be seen again until the import tuner movement of the 1990s. and the modifications people did to these engines were legendary. Hot Rod magazine featured a build where they took a junkyard 360, spent $1,500, and made 427 horsepower. They used stock J-heads with a good valve job, KB pistons for 10.5.1 compression, a crane cam with 508 lift, and an Edelbrock intake with a 750 Holly. That's it. No exotic parts, no machine shop wizardry, just smart combinations of affordable pieces. That article became one of their most requested reprints ever. Then the street racing scene of the mid-1970s was dominated by 360 cars. In Detroit, a primer gray 71 Duster known as Irish the Gray Ghost was undefeated for 2 years. It ran a stock-appearing 360 with ported heads, headers, and a healthy shot of nitrous. The owner claimed it was just a grocery getter to avoid attention. In Los Angeles, a group called the Angio 360 Mafiage would show up at street races with identical-looking Dart Sports, all running hot 360s. They'd bet unsuspecting big block owners and Chrysler's engineers kept refining the 360 even as performance supposedly died. In 1978, they released the Lil Red Express truck with the E58 360, making Hodge only 170 horsepower, but actually producing closer to 225. It was the fastest American vehicle you could buy that year, faster than the Corvette. In 1979, they created the 360 Police Interceptor package that made 195 net horsepower and could push a 4,400-pound Dodge St. Regis to 130 mph. These engines proved that the 3-60 formula still worked, even in the darkest days of the malaise era. Next, the comparison with contemporary engines really drives home how special the 360 was. The Oldsmobile 350 Rocket, once mighty, was making 160 horsepower by 1974. The Buick 350 managed 165. Even Chrysler's own 400 Big Block was only rated at 185 horsepower and got 9 mpg. The 360 made nearly the same power from 40 fewer cubic inches while delivering almost twice the fuel economy. It wasn't magic. It was superior engineering applied intelligently within the constraints of the era. And today, finding a good 360 core is like striking gold for budget builders. These engines are still everywhere: junkyards, Craigslist, swap meets. A complete running 360 might cost $500, but with modern technology, these old warriors can make serious power. Aluminum heads flow 270 CFM. Roller cams can push 0.600-inch lift. Electronic fuel injection solves all the carburetor issues. A modern 360 build can easily exceed 500 horsepower while maintaining street manners that would have been impossible in the 1970s. The influence of the 360 philosophy, making power through efficiency rather than brute force, can be seen in modern engines. Today's 5.7 Hemi makes 390 horsepower from 345 cubic inches. The Coyote 5.0 makes 460 horsepower from 302 cubes. These engines use the same principles the 360 pioneered: excellent head flow, optimized cam timing, and precise fuel delivery. They just do it with computers and variable valve timing instead of thermoquads and mechanical advance. Think about this for a moment. In an era when government regulations were strangling performance, when insurance companies were killing the muscle car, when fuel prices were making V8s seem obsolete, Chrysler engineers created an engine that somehow thrived. It wasn't the strongest engine ever built. It wasn't the most advanced. But it was exactly what America needed at exactly the right time. It kept the flame of performance alive when everyone else was giving up. The 360 taught us that displacement isn't everything, that clever engineering beats brute force, that working within constraints can actually produce better solutions than having unlimited freedom. Every modern turbocharged four-cylinder making 300 horsepower owes something to the philosophy the 360 embodied, that efficiency and performance aren't mutually exclusive, they're complementary. When we look back at the malaise era, We usually focus on what was lost, the death of the muscle car, the end of real performance. But the 360 tells a different story. It's the story of engineers who refused to give up, who found ways to make power when power was illegal, who built an engine so good that it survived virtually unchanged for over 30 years. In the darkest hour of American performance, the 360 was the light that refused to go out. Oh, it went in. So the next time someone tells you the 1970s killed performance, tell them about the 360. Tell them about the small block that made 275 horsepower when everyone else was making 165. Tell them about the engine that could run 14-second quarter miles and get 16 mpg. Tell them about the forged crank, the flowing heads, the massive carburetor that somehow passed emissions. Tell them about the engine that proved American ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. The Mopar 360 wasn't just the strongest small block of the Smog-Era. It was proof that performance never really died. It just learned to hide in plain sight. And what's your favorite story of an underdog engine that punched above its weight? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most underrated engines, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started exploring the engineering marvels that kept performance alive when the world tried to kill it. Until next time, keep those small blocks screaming.